All right, so here is a version of a background for low poly that you can create. This is basically, I have got my low poly animal. My background is a little different. That's fine. This is an option that you can choose. This is a gradient background. And so we'll get into how to create gradients as well for this project. I got my fish here. The gradient is on a separate layer all by itself. In fact, this should be labeled gradient background. And there we go. What I'm going to do is create that for this one here. I'm going to turn that off, turn this on. And I'm going to create my background on a separate layer, not on the same layer as my animal. So I'm going to create a new layer down here. And I'm going to turn my animal off so I don't see it. Now for a gradient, I don't necessarily need this to be I don't need a grid to show up. So I'm going to turn off on view. I'm going to go to hide grid. I'm going to go to view. I'm going to turn off snap to grid because I don't need that. What I do want to do though is create a gradient that's going to cover this whole background right here, this whole artboard. Okay, so to create my gradient, what I'm going to do is first find my gradient tool, G on here, and if I click out here, nothing's going to happen. I don't have anything to put a gradient on. So I have to first create a rectangle that's just going to cover this whole background here. It doesn't really matter what your rectangle color is because that's going to change anyways. So this is going to be my background. I'm going to cover the whole artboard with this. I'm going to make sure that my other things are turned off as well. Visibility is turned off and they're locked. I'm only working on my gradient background, which in fact, I'm going to call this gradient background. Now I'm going to use my gradient tool, click on this. If I click here, a gradient pops up, but that's not the gradient that I want. That would look terrible with my animal. So I'm going to find something else that looks better. And in order to do that, I'm going to go to Window. I'm going to go to Gradient, and I have options here to play with. Now this is a tool that we hopefully have been introduced to already, and what I'm going to do is create a gradient and customize this gradient with at least 3 colors. That's going to make it look good. Now since I'm dealing with a fish, I'm going to think about something that's in the blues, right? And I can create some nice gradients with different shades of blue. And so I'm going to click on this little guy right here. This is the white, and so if I double click on this, I want to choose something in kind of a lighter bluish color. So something like that maybe, and you can adjust this however you need to. But I'll find a good bluish, light bluish color, something pretty light like that. And then I'm going to change my darkest one over here. I'll double click on this guy. Now I see it's black. I'm going to change that to something that's like a dark, deeper blue. So something, and I see the sample showing up in the window here. Something that's really dark, maybe even close to purplish, to be part of my gradient background. Now that's great, but I need to add more to it. So I'm going to click back here on my gradient tab, and when I hover my cursor underneath this gradient, I'll see that I have a plus sign that shows up because I want to add another gradient to it. So I'm going to click right here, and a new one pops up. And it already kind of picked something in between. But if I want to customize that, double click on it and choose your own color that would look good for that. And so I found a good color. I think that looks pretty good. That's a nice gradient. And if I want to customize it even more, I can add more colors to it as well and add kind of even a softer or smoother kind of gradient from one color to the next. So I kind of like that. That's pretty smooth looking gradient there. So I'm going to go with that, and I can customize this. How much of these colors do I want to show? So as I affect this and where these colors are, it changes how much of each one I want to have in there. Oh, now I doubled one, so I'm going to undo that. I accidentally clicked next to it, and so it created an extra one. If you create too many like that, if you highlight it and just hit delete, it will go away. But I've got a good 4-color gradient here. If I want lots of dark, then I can do that. But then my gradient kind of gets messed up. And so this is a linear gradient. So if I look up here, it says linear gradient if I hover over it. If I go radial gradient, kind of changes it. And then I also have this one, freeform gradient, which means you can kind of customize that as you want. I'm not going to get into that because that has a lot of extra other settings to it. I'm going to go back to gradient for now because I could also adjust it how it looks on the actual artboard. And I can adjust these diamonds as well to show different kind of effects that gives. Now, if I hover to one end, I can grab this little guy and move it down this way or shift it this way. So I can really have a lot of control over the gradient. I could even turn it upright and move it down like that. I can shrink it down as well so I see more of my gradient colors showing up in this way. Now this is almost the opposite of what I would actually want it to be. So I would actually probably want it to be more light on top and dark on the bottom, especially since I'm dealing with kind of an underwater scene. So it could be something more like this. And if I decide, hey, that's too much light, I can bring that up and stretch this down that way. So I can customize this how I want it to look. I can also say, hey, I want a radial gradient and customize this as well. I can stretch this out. I can add more color to it and less white. And I can take out some of that if I want to. And so you can really fine tune this and adjust based on what kind of gradient you want, what kind of shape do you like, where do you want this gradient to be placed, could be another thing that you adjust. So clicking other places will give it another location. And you can move the whole thing around. You can rotate this and decide where it goes. Now, once I'm done deciding where I want this guy to be, then I can move this guy someplace else. I can draw out a new gradient in a new place with the round one, something like that. Or I can drag it out over here and then see what that looks like with my animal on top. And that's pretty cool. Now, since my animal is frozen or locked, I'm not going to affect anything on that layer, but I can draw out different options. I kind of like that too. And once I'm done deciding on where I want my gradient to go, I'm ready to export. So I'm going to go to File, Export, Export As. Change this, save as type, change it to JPEG. Typically it's going to be a J or PNG, so change it to JPEG. Give it a name, call it Fulton. I already have a low poly, so I'm going to call it low poly fish. And I'm going to find where I want it to go save to, which is going to be in your student drive. Go to your digital media, go to Illustrator and low poly if you have that, and export. Keep the color mode, change it to CMYK if it's not already there. Keep this as medium. Change the resolution to high 300 ppi, good for printing. And then everything else will stay the same. And I'll click OK. I would always go back and locate that and make sure that it's saved the way you wanted it to, make sure that everything is the way it should be, and check it out and see how it looks. This is going to be the thing that you actually turn in, as well as your project file, which is your big file like this. So when you go to File, Save As, Illustrator, make sure that yours is in there as Fulton or your last name or your first name, and low poly. I'll call this low poly fish, doesn't matter, because this is going to save as an Adobe Illustrator file, and I'm going to save that and click OK. And that is pretty much it.